We've been talking about God's salvation story, and it's an amazing story. God's plan to bring humanity back into his presence. What we need to do is just do an overview, a rehearsal, review of what we've already learned, and then we'll be ready to go forward from there. So first of all, just so we all understand and remember, the Bible is God's salvation story. That's number one right there. It begins with the king and queen of creation, Adam and Eve, living in Eden. And that's really important. Standing in God's presence, without fear, without any problems. The story tells the terrible tragedy of how the human race rebelled against their Creator and then became terrified of their Creator, blaming each other, and then receiving this horrible curse upon the earth and childbirth and upon death and all of these awful things that happen because of sin. And God exiled the human race from Eden, and this concept of exile is really important in this story. And God guarded the entrance with a flaming sword. So it's forbidden. We can't go. So the question in the Bible, right from the start, after chapter 3 of Genesis, is how can the human race ever return to God's presence? God must free them from their slavery, their exile of slavery to Satan. So God promised that Eve's seed would free the human race from its slavery to the snake, who is Satan. You see the snake there, but that snake is actually Satan. God said this to the snake: I will put hatred between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. Now, that's an interesting story. So the salvation story of God is about this seed coming from Eve, not from Adam, but Eve. And the seed coming from Eve is going to be bitten by the snake, but he's also going to crush the snake. So this is God's salvation story. This is the plan. God's plan to free humanity from slavery to Satan and bring them back into his presence. And remember, it's a story about God's presence. And it's a story about that seed passing from Eve to Seth, from Seth to his son Enosh, passing generation after generation through Noah, Noah's son Shem, generation by generation, all the way to Abraham, who became Abraham, until finally, in the end, it comes to Jesus Christ. So it's a story about God's presence. It's a story about that seed passing from generation to generation. And the story is about the place of God's presence. First Eden, then Canaan. Here's the temple with the glory of God in it. And finally, the new heavens and the new earth. And God's salvation story is about faith in God's promises. So Noah believed God and built a boat. Abraham believed God, waiting 25 years, then offering that son who was born as a sacrifice. How did he do it? It was his faith in God. Joseph believed God and lived through slavery in prison because he believed what God had promised. Moses believed God, and he commanded Pharaoh to set God's people free. How could he come to stand before Pharaoh? Because he believed God. That's the story about people who believe what God promises. In God's salvation story, people are not saved by how good they are, but they are saved by their faith in God's promise of the Messiah, just like today, just like then. Step by step, God revealed himself to the people in his salvation story as I am who I am, as the promise keeper, as the Lord over heaven and earth. So the whole story of God's salvation story is in it. It's just not about what happened. It's also about God and how he reveals himself step by step, more and more powerfully and more gloriously and more encouragingly and more helpingly, if that's a word. In God's salvation story, the plan was always the same, passing on the seed. Boy, that's gigantic in God's salvation story. It's about how the seed goes from Seth to his son Enosh and onward, step by step, until finally we come to Jesus Christ. It's also about journeying to the place of God's promise, which is first Eden, and then when they're exiled from Eden, then it becomes Canaan, and then they go into exile, and then they come back to Canaan. But then there's more than that. It's also the new heavens and the new earth. And then finally, the story, the plan is always the same, seeking God's presence. So as we're going to look at the next sermon in this salvation story of God, as we get ready to do this, we always need to keep in mind that everything we're going to discuss in the future, it's all based upon the fact that God has done these great things in the past in his salvation story. And actually, the salvation story of God, it's still going on. In fact, you and I, we are literally a part of God's salvation story. The passing on of the seed, well, Jesus Christ has come, so now we pass on Jesus Christ. We journey to the place of God's promise, which is Jesus Christ, and we seek his presence through the indwelling presence of God the Holy Spirit. So, salvation story hasn't finished, and we are a part of it. Look forward to seeing you again.